Chapter 2. They collided in a new world, otherwise alone in an empty field. The sky was bright blue, the grass was green, and the air smelled sweet after a day in a dark cell. Dahiel blinked to clear his eyes from the gloom of the prison. Maren was almost as shaky as he was, but her fear left her quickly. While he could still barely breathe, she looked up at the new sky and laughed gleefully. Maren was always ecstatic when they stepped through to a new world. Dahiel envied her. His first thought in any new world was to look for danger and to remember what had gone wrong in the last. His scythe had come to him when the jailers had taken Maren from him, though against 20 guards, all armed and armored, it had done him little good. He dismissed it now. It was the first guardian's trick Dahiel had ever learned. He just held the scythe in one hand and thought about how it would be better if he didn't have the weapon right now. Much of what he had learned of guardian magic seemed based on this kind of instinctive willpower. When he managed to make things work, it was almost always because he truly needed it to. Right now, he needed to know where they were. He let go of the star and stood up to get a better look around. When Maren had been a small child, Dahiel had always needed to keep hold of her hand in a new world, or she would wander away, staring about her like she was on a tour. Maren was 15 now, still shorter than almost any girl her age, but looking more and more like a young woman. Dahiel was 18, and other than looking rather underfed, he was just as average as ever. There was nothing nearby except for a couple of trees and a small stream. They hadn't been in the prison for long, but Dahiel was still thirsty from the fight he had given their captors. He sat on the bank and dipped his hands into the water. The water was cool against his bruised knuckles. His hands were leaving streaks of red running down the stream. He shuddered and dropped his hands deep into the sandy bed, using the grit to scrub away the bloodstains. It was not uncommon for Dahiel to have blood or worse on his hands when he stepped through to a new world. He hated it. It was horrifying to kill to protect Maren, but it seemed so much worse to just leave them, possibly dead, possibly dying, with no comfort or help. He splashed water on his face, and as it dripped down onto his shirt, he looked down at himself. He was splattered with blood, and he had no memory of it happening. He threw himself into the stream. It was cold, but he let the icy water run over him until the red washed away. He was shaking when he climbed out of the water. Maren didn't say anything as her guardian flopped down onto the grass and stared at the sun. It was orangey yellow. The two of them had seen suns in every color of the rainbow, but this one was so subtly different from the one they were born under that it made Dahiel wonder if he even remembered the way his home sky looked. He knew the sky was blue and the sun was yellow, but they were just words. The actual memories were gone. He sighed, unsure whether the tears streaming down his face were from staring at the sun or from his dismal thoughts. After a moment, he realized Maren was singing. The tune brought the vaguest memories of home to Dahiel, flashed pictures of monks singing to small children in their care. His shaking was fading, and for a moment he forgot to worry about what was coming next. He might not have fallen asleep, but he remained still and relatively calm until this new sun had gently dried his soaking clothes. Dahiel sighed. They would need new clothes. It was always the first job to be taken care of in a new place. His life would be much simpler if fashion was just a little bit more consistent. Before he had gone into the stream, he had noticed large white buildings in the distance. There would be the best bet. He dragged himself to his feet, offered a hand to the star, and they started down the road. Maren saw the men approaching first and squeezed Dahiel's hand in warning. The guardian had plenty of time to get a good look before they were in hailing distance. They were on horseback, which was a good sign. If people rode horses as transportation, chances were good that there wouldn't be any strange technology to learn. There were 4 men. 3 had brown hair, but 1 was blonde. They were not abnormally large or small. There was nothing about them that would make Dahiel or Maren stand out. Their clothes were different, but not so different that he would need an excuse for why they were in costume. The star and her guardian did look rather ragged compared to the riders, but Dahiel and Maren's regular excuse of being orphans would usually explain away such signs of neglect. The men called out to them as they came closer. "Hey, you kids!" His voice was gruff and unwelcoming, but Dahiel took comfort in the fact that he recognized the words. He knew almost a dozen languages from different worlds, just well enough to slip through social chatter, but there was always a possibility of new ones. "What are you two doing out here?" The men did not even speak with an accent that much different from Dial's. Dial shrugged, trying not to let his nerves show. "My sister and I are heading—" He trailed off slowly, pointing towards the white buildings. He didn't know what to call the place, but he had found long ago that if he trailed off, people tended to fill in the gaps. "The camp?" the man barked at him. "It's not often we have kids taking themselves to the camp." Dial waited, hoping to come up with more information before he had to come up with an explanation. Maren squeezed his hand, whispering in his ear, "It's not a loved place." He put his arm around the star's shoulder to cover her words. "You'll have to excuse my sister, sir. She's nervous." The men laughed, which was not encouraging, considering Dial had pretty much committed them to going to this place. A second man, the blonde, pushed his horse forward, waving the first back and turning towards Maren with something of a kind smile. "When did you lose your parents?" Dial was surprised and a little uneasy that the man seemed to have guessed his excuse before he could mention it. "A year ago, sir." From his expression, Dial guessed the man had expected a different answer. The first man snorted. "A year? Your pretty little sister must have been very scared to keep you two away from the camp for a whole year." Dial swallowed nervously. He had aroused their suspicions, but the men were obviously already forming their own conclusion of who these two children were. The trick would be finding out what story these men had invented before saying anything to disillusion them. "Come on, Andrew. The kids were just scared. With all the rumors going on about the camp, you can hardly expect anything else." The blond man stepped down off the horse and smiled at Maren, who was playing her part well and hiding behind Dial's shoulder. "You kids don't need to worry. The camp was set up to take care of kids like you. Sometimes kids lose their parents. It's horrible, but it happens. That's what the camp is for. Now, what are you scared of, miss?" Maren clearly had no idea. She buried her head in Dial's shoulder. "Don't be scared. Tell me, have you been listening to those stories of kids going missing? Is that it?" Maren latched onto the offer. She nodded. "Now, the state takes good care of its kids. You have to grow up to protect our country and fight for our freedom. We're not going to let you get lost." One of the other men snorted. "The camp hasn't lost a kid since the group desertion 2 years ago." The blond man shushed his companion, showing a sharpness that he had previously kept well hidden. But when he turned back to Maren, all signs of ill temper was gone. "Does that make you feel better?" Maren neither moved nor spoke. The man was still smiling at her, but she was beginning to shake. Maren couldn't stand lying. Dial squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm all my sister has. She just gets scared, and we've had a rough year." The first man pushed his horse forward. "A rough year?" He turned to his companion. "I want to know how they hid from the patrols for an entire fucking year." Dial knew he didn't have enough information to form a realistic story, so he waited silently while the blond man defended them. "They were obviously living rough. I mean, look at them. They're wearing rags, and she looks like she hasn't eaten in days. What does it matter if they've been hiding from the patrols? They are ready to do their duty, rejoin society, and go to the camp. Let's just get them there." To show they meant to be obedient, Dial let the blond man pull Maren up behind him on his horse. He was more than willing to walk, but as he started out, the first man pulled his horse around. "Oh, no, you don't, kid. You're not going to drop your sister at the camp and go back to your pleasant bachelor life. You belong to the army now." The man grabbed Dial's upper arm and yanked him across the back of his horse. He did not resist, though it felt like his arm would come out of the socket, and waited until the man let go before he wiggled around to a more comfortable position. Maren was watching him, her beautiful eyes full of worry. He nodded reassuringly to her, but he was worried too. When they got to this camp, there would be questions, and he did not have enough information to answer them believably. "What's going to happen to us when we get to the camp?" Maren's voice quavered, but did just what Dahiel needed. The blond man started talking. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll vouch that you came willingly, and what business is it of theirs if it was a little delayed?" His smile set Dial's teeth on edge, but she was getting information, and so he concentrated on the man's words. It's just like school, but you'll get to live with all your classmates. You'll get 3 meals a day and have a warm bed, which has to be better than living in the wilds or hiding in back alleys. Yes, most of your classes will be geared towards your future in the military, but it's not like you will suddenly find yourself on the front. Your brother will probably be starting on his training pretty quickly, but a delicate little thing like you will be looking at a future as a nurse or messenger. You'll serve your country in a way that uses your skills and your talents. Dial listened carefully as the man babbled on, but found himself no more ready to face the camp when the horses were let in at the 2-story tall gate than when he had been on the bank of the stream. The salutes the men received at the gate cemented his growing apprehension. The blond man was already helping Maren down from his horse, but Dial's captor held him until the gate was shut behind them, and 3 armored guards had surrounded them. The men weren't pointing their crossbows at him, but every guard had one, and they were all primed. Dial was beginning to understand. They thought he was a deserter, and he was becoming more certain by the moment that, given a chance, he would be. What he had taken as a series of buildings was really one giant structure. They were in an empty, clean-swept yard surrounded by tall, solid white walls. Aisles followed the main wall off in both directions. There were guard towers on either side of the gate, and 3 more across from it on top of the main building. It was a prison, for all that these men had called it a camp, and Dial had led them right to it. They were pulled into the nearest door without anyone saying a word, and sat down in a small room. The first thing that he noticed was how white everything was. The walls were white, the ceiling was white, the floor was as white as a floor could be. It had to be on purpose, meaningful somehow, but he had no way to know what it meant. Nothing occupied the room except the simple wooden chairs and a large wooden desk. The room had a small window high up on the far wall, and there was a lantern. Lanterns were a good sign. Dahiel and Maren both understood oil lamps. Dahiel was almost positive that they were being watched, or at least being listened to. He wanted to ask Maren if she had picked up on anything else on the ride, but he kept silent, only reaching across the gap between their chairs to squeeze her hand once before the door behind them opened. The man that entered was nothing impressive physically, even his dark gray uniform plain and barely adorned, nothing but brass buttons and strips of rank across the upper arm. He carried a stack of papers, and pointedly did not look at them as he sat behind the desk. Names? Dahiel jumped, startled by the sharp question, but answered swiftly. Dahiel and Maren. Daniel and Mary Smith, the man repeated back, as he copied the names down. He did not correct the man, knowing that their names might give them away, though he did wonder where the Smith had come from. Age? I am 16 and my sister is 15, Dahiel lied. Experience had taught him that the closer their perceived age, the less likely they were to be separated. Few people believed him when he gave his true age anyway. Daniel Barracks 16, Mary Barracks 25, dismissed. Dahiel did not move for a moment. There had to be something more. He had never faced so few questions in his life. Maren looked as startled as he felt. The man finally looked up from his papers. I said dismissed. Dahiel stood quickly, eager to escape before the man changed his mind, but stopped almost immediately. There was a man by the door that he had not noticed. He was armed, carrying a naked dagger in his belt and a spear in his hand. Dahiel should have known he was there. Guardians were very hard to sneak up on, especially with a star in tow. The star nudged the back of Dahiel's shin with her foot. The man behind the desk was watching them with a curious look on his face. The guard was readjusting his grips on his weapons. He was not acting the way they expected, and that could be very dangerous. He forced himself forward into the reach of the guard and opened the door. He let Maren go through first, trying to watch her back without drawing any more attention, but he felt his shoulders crawl as he stepped past the guard. The man followed him into the hallway and loomed in the background while Dahiel looked around for a sign of what to do next. One hallway looked much like another, all white and precisely squared off. Even the lanterns were evenly distributed along the halls, providing even, barely varying light. Dahiel was at a loss. He was almost ready to just ask the guard where to go when he noticed a girl coming down the nearest hallway. She was dressed in a rougher and even plainer version of the uniform that both the guard and the man who had taken their names wore, but was clearly around Dahiel's age. She stood at ease and saluted, managing to make it look insolent. "I heard we got new brats, Sarge." The guard nodded, breaking his stoic facade to grin at the girl. "Daniel for Barracks 16 and Mary for 25. "Just the two? Where'd they come from?" The guard did not seem bothered by the questions. Instead, he grinned like he was sharing an inside joke. "They just came wandering in out of the fields." The girl raised an eyebrow at Dahiel and Maren. She was not unpretty, with rather strong features. She was taller than Dahiel, though he still had not seen enough people of this world to determine if she would be considered tall. She had darker skin than the others they had met so far, almost brown. Her eyes were almost black, and her dark hair was tied tightly back from her face, pulling her features sharply. She was examining Dahiel as closely as he was examining her. "Do they speak?" Her sarcastic tone jolted Dahiel. He bristled. "Yes, when addressed." Both she and the guard laughed, which made him immediately regret his sharp tone. "Don't get worked up, kid. I'll take you from here." She half-heartedly saluted the guard and headed off, without looking to see if they followed. "I'm Tallulah Smith, Barrack 16. Come on. We've got to see the corporal first." As they followed the girl down hall after hall, the bright whites of the walls and ceiling became less sharp, whitewash grown old. The place was bigger than Dahiel had initially guessed. It had to be as large as a small city and almost entirely enclosed. There were few windows, all small and high, but hundreds of doors and side passages. They met few people, but those they did meet watched them intently and silently. The girl, Tallulah, mostly paid them little to no attention, though occasionally she would stop and salute, moving too quickly for Dahiel to even decide whether he should mimic her or not. The corporal turned out to be an efficient older woman in a gigantic storeroom. She barely glanced over them before she started walking up and down the aisles of shelves, pulling out pieces of clothing here and there before handing them over. Dahiel barely had to glance to know they were the gray uniforms, just like the ones Tallulah wore. As she walked, the corporal rattled off a list of rules. The rules were mostly simple, though an awful lot to remember. There were rules about the exact way they were to dress, where they were and were not allowed to talk, what they were allowed to talk about, where they were allowed to go within the building, how they were to make their beds and keep their things, and every other possible element of their lives. Even Maren was looking significantly less than pleased about the prospects of their near future. They would wake each morning at 5 o'clock and would be expected to be cleaned up and at their first exercises by 5:15. Breakfast would be served at 7. They would be in classes from 7:30 till noon, when they would have 30 minutes for lunch. After lunch, there would be 4 hours of either chores or training, depending on their skill levels. Another 4 hours of class were followed by a short dinner and something called squad assimilation. Dahiel and Maren would be separated, living in separate barracks and attending separate classes. To make matters worse, the corporal added that the different barrack groups were discouraged from associating except for the weekly barrack competitions. Dahiel did not fight or even argue when the woman led Maren away. She was not in any immediate danger. He always knew when she was in real danger. He had to trust his instincts, and as much as he felt that he had just led them into a snake pit, he knew that their best bet would be to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. Tallulah led Dahiel to their barracks, and after waiting for him to change into the simple gray uniform, back out into the hall. She did not speak to him, just walked along with her hands shoved deep in her pockets. It was a long and convoluted walk. There would be no way he would remember any of these paths later, but from what the corporal had said, he didn't expect that he would be traveling them alone. Everything seemed to be done in groups, specifically squads. They would live with their squad, eat with their squad, and have classes with their squads. They stopped in front of a door, and Tallulah gave him a quick grin before she opened it. He found himself faced with at least 30 boys and girls around his age, and he had never entered a classroom that was so silent. No one chattered or whispered, no one even giggled. The teacher nodded to Dahiel and Tallulah, but obviously had no intention of interrupting the lecture. They were still there 10 minutes later when the man finally finished explaining the strategies and results of some random battle, and turned towards the two waiting at the door. Tallulah stood to attention, saluting sharply. "New recruit Daniel Smith, reporting for assignment." The teacher nodded. "Dismissed, Miss Smith. Mr. Smith, front and center." Dahiel stepped to the front of the classroom and tried to mimic the way Tallulah had saluted. He did it clumsily, but the students did not laugh. "That is correct, Mr. Smith, but your form needs improvement. We will now test the level of your relative knowledge and training. How long have you been out of school, Mr. Smith?" Dahiel suspected what answer he should give, but he had already unwittingly committed himself to having been outside of normal society at least a year, so he might as well use the time to explain his complete lack of knowledge about this world. "Around 2 years. You will address me as Teacher Smith." The teacher was obviously surprised, but neither he nor the student said a word about it. "We will start with history." And so the testing began. For over an hour, Dahiel made wild guesses in response to question after question in front of the class. The teacher did not even tell the boy when he was right or wrong, just asked another question as soon as Dahiel stopped speaking. Dahiel was thirsty and scared, but he did not waver. He could not let the man know how scared he was. Finally, the teacher ran out of questions. Silence filled the room while the man took down some notes on a clipboard. Dahiel shifted uncomfortably and glanced around. There were high windows on the far wall to let in light, too high for anyone to see the world outside of the building, but from this angle he could at least see the sky and the passing clouds. The walls were already beginning to bother him. He had never liked enclosed spaces, but after the prison of the previous world, the walls made his shoulders twitch. "You may sit, Mr. Smith." The teacher pointed towards a desk near the back, and Dahiel headed towards it, but stopped when the man cleared his throat. "You will always wait for me to dismiss you before moving, Mr. Smith." He paused, obviously waiting to see if Dahiel would catch on, and just when Dahiel began to wonder if he had somehow missed the signal, he barked, "Dismissed!" Dahiel rushed to his seat before the man could change his mind and make him stand there any longer. He sank into the chair gratefully, and the lecture began again almost before he settled. He tried to listen, but it meant very little to him. He had too few reference points. His mind wandered. His stomach was grumbling. He was worried about Maren. She hadn't eaten in just as long as him, and she was so tiny. He fought the urge to sigh and forced himself to look attentive. Would dinner be any time soon? He had absolutely no idea what time it was. His instincts told him that it couldn't be early morning, and if he remembered the schedule correctly, it had to be somewhere between the hours of 4:30 and 8:30. The sky was still bright, and assuming it wasn't midsummer and that this world didn't have a different structure of counting time, it had to be at least a couple of hours before dinner. He needed to force himself to stop worrying about Maren. There was a pencil and some paper on his desk. He would take notes on what the teacher was saying. He stopped before the pencil touched the page and snuck a glance at the student next to him. The boy was writing furiously. But just as Dahiel had feared, he felt no recognition for the writing on the page. It might have had something to do with the boy's horrible handwriting, but he doubted it. But he was never going to remember any of this stuff without taking notes. Of course, bad handwriting was an excuse that could go either way, and he could do bad handwriting. He would just have to be careful not to let anyone else get too good a look at his notes. He had completely filled 2 pages before the sky outside the high windows began to darken. The teacher did not stop, just waved 2 students to go around the room, lighting gas lamps. Dahiel had spent most of his time as a small child behind a desk, reading, studying, and listening to lectures, but it had also been almost a decade since it had been a regular part of his life. His back kept twitching, his eyes itched, and he fought to keep still. When the teacher finally set down the book he was reading from and called an end to class, Dahiel happily pushed his chair back. The sound of his chair legs scratching against the polished wood floor stopped him. No one else was moving. The teacher stared at him and cleared his throat. "Dismissed, Mr. Smith." Dahiel waited while the rest of the class headed for the door, leaning his chair back against the desk behind him. He carefully folded his notes away and tucked them in his pocket. The room was almost empty. Dahiel rubbed his brow ridge. He should get up. He was almost weak with hunger, and if he remembered the schedule correctly, dinner was next. The not inconsiderable impact of a hand into the back of his head pulled him out of his self-pity. "Come on, Smith, no lazing about." The girl from before, Tallulah, was standing over him. Dahiel followed the girl out into the hall, filing in at the end of an imperfect line of students. Most of the children were silent, but here and there sounds of quiet chatter drifted down the line. Dahiel let the sounds wash meaninglessly over him until a silence fell, and he looked up to see his classmates' line straighten out as an older man passed by. He ignored the youths as they passed, only giving a passing glance to Dahiel at the end of the line. "Don't stare at superior officers, Smith." Tallulah's voice pulled Dahiel's eyes away. He hadn't realized that he was staring. The girl snorted. "Do you want to miss dinner? If you're not in your place by the dinner bell, you'll be running laps instead of eating." They made it to the dining hall with just enough time to step into the last empty spots before the bell rang. Dahiel watched Tallulah, and when she continued standing, he did the same. While he waited, he looked around. The whitewashed walls flashed back the light of dozens of oil lamps onto rows of low benches and long, whitewashed tables. By the glaring light, Dahiel's eyes searched out his star among the hundreds of children. He found her easily. She stood uneasily with a group of younger students across the room. Even from this distance, she looked tired and ill at ease. Then she smiled in response to something a boy next to her had said. The effect was easily noticeable from where Dahiel stood. As the boy, and most of the table around Maren, smiled back at the girl, Dahiel's heart calmed. She was finding a place here, which meant they would be safe, for a while at least. Dahiel took the cue to sit from the children at Maren's table. It was only when the boy in front of him cut off his line of sight that he brought his attention back to the people at his own table. "Pay attention, Smith. Take the tray and pass it." Dahiel looked up to see Tallulah pointedly waving a tray of potatoes towards him. "Sorry." At the sight of food, he couldn't understand how he had failed to notice it. She didn't say anything about how much he could take, and so he made sure the tray was significantly lighter when he passed it on. A tray of some kind of greens passed next, and he took enough that he had a perfect excuse not to take any of the meat that passed around next. Dahiel waited until the others began to eat, but he didn't have to wait long. It seemed that as soon as the food hit the plate, it was fair game. He was not the only one to dig in with gusto, and it was not long before the plates were empty. It was just in time, as Dahiel was just offering a silent thanks for his food when the students around him stood, some with bread still in their hands and food in their mouths. And then Dahiel found himself silently following the line of children back through the halls. As soon as the group reached the barracks, all order fell apart. Boys and girls veered off to sink bonelessly down onto their cots or clump around the rough wooden tables. They went from almost silent to just shy of yelling before the door had even shut. Tallulah batted Dahiel's shoulder in passing. "Well, come on." Dahiel had no idea what was expected of him, but he followed her over to the nearest table, where one of the largest clumps of children was dealing out what looked like a deck of handmade playing cards. "All right, Daniel Smith. This is Mark Tucker, David Smith, Roger Smith, Tobias Smith, Edgar Allen, and Chris Smith. Boys, this is your new roommate, Daniel Smith." "Hello." Dahiel stood awkwardly as Tallulah snatched a seat from one of the smaller boys, and everyone else stared at him. He searched for something to say. That's a lot of Smiths." The one Dahiel thought was the Roger laughed. "We're a lot of orphans. Most of the workhouse students are in the other barracks. Even here, at the lowest of the low, they want us to remember that there are distinctions." The two boys whose last name were not Smith spoke up, their words overlapping as they rose to their own defense. "They don't treat us any different. It's not our fault our parents are still alive." It was obviously a common theme. The others ignored them, instead turning their attention back on Dahiel. Chris, maybe, leaned forward. "You were out of school for 2 years? How the fuck did you manage that?" Dahiel shrugged, none too happy to have finally found the brazen curiosity he had expected when he first arrived. We hid." "Someone had to be hiding you." Dahiel was having trouble keeping the boys separate. There were just too many of them to remember which was which, and more were coming over from the different groups in the room. He shook his head, trying to answer the questions put before him before he was overwhelmed with others. No, we were alone." "We? Who was with you?" "My sister, Maren." "Did you go north? They say there's a lot of unclaimed land up there since the last war." "Ooh, or the Sally Plains. There's no one out there." No, man, they had to be in the city. Hide in plain sight. Come on, Daniel, tell us who hid you. Was it the wild ones? Did you hide with them? The bombardment of questions ended suddenly, and Dahiel looked around desperately into the hushed silence. He had no idea what to say. His eye caught Tallulah. She had remained surprisingly silent so far, but she was watching him with a scrutiny that was uncomfortably reminiscent of the test he had taken in front of the class. Dahiel swallowed. No, we were alone. Ignorance had to be his best weapon, because, to be frank, it was his only one. Keep denying and saying as little as possible. It was advice he had been given years ago on a world not unlike this one by a woman who had risked her life to save Maren. It was very good advice. Whatever was going on, it seemed he made the right choice. Just as the roar of questions started up again, Tallulah spoke. Why don't you leave him alone, you ill-tempered hellions? He just got here 5 hours ago. He hasn't even had a chance to get heartburn from the food. A girl laughed. Or get laps for getting a question wrong on a quiz. How did you stay so calm? I was practically pissing myself during the examination, and I came in at the beginning of term. Dahiel looked over at the small boy who had wandered over from one of the tables. How did that help? No shit. I had 12 other kids doing it with me. And fuck, man, you got like every question wrong. I would have been fucking passed out on the floor. Most of the room was watching and nodding. Dahiel certainly hadn't been calm, and if he had realized how universally terrifying the experience was, he would not have attempted to hide it so much. Wait. A tall boy pushed his way through the group. Tallulah says you just got in. What's going on out there? Did the war start yet? That question set off another series of questions, the ones Dahiel feared the most. He could make up his own past, but believable current events were beyond him. Did they raise the buyout on the draft? Have they found the guy who was killing soldiers near Brisnorth? Who'd they get elected as Major General? Luckily the questions came so quickly Dahiel couldn't even try to answer. Oi! I said leave Newsmith alone. Okay, dipshits? He's been in hiding for like 2 years. He doesn't know if your Aunt Marge's bakery went under. The youths mostly calmed, but the boy who had started it was still standing front and center. Yeah, but did the war start yet? Everyone was watching him expectantly again. Don't you know? The boy snorted. No. They don't tell us that sort of thing. We won't know until they start shipping the upper classes out with hand-me-down uniforms and wooden swords. He stopped himself, laughing half-heartedly. That's not fair of me. They always deck us out good and proper for a war. After all, what would our heathen neighbors think if our army didn't look top shape? There was enough bitterness in the boy's words that Dahiel had no question about whether this deployment would be voluntary. While he pretended to have forgotten he had been asked a question, the boy watched him skeptically. You really don't know, do you? About what? Oh, the war? No, I'm afraid I missed almost everything that's happened in the last few years. All right, break it up. You can play with the new toy tomorrow. Give him some room. Tallulah shooed the others away until it was just a couple of the boys she had already introduced. Or Dahiel thought it was the same boys? There were too many of them, all with the same clothes and similar names. That must have been some serious hiding, if you don't know if the war has started. The boy was heavier built than many of the others. His shoulders were broader and stronger. Dahiel was almost positive that the tall boy had been one of the 5 he had been introduced to, but he could not remember which name was attached to him. Maybe he read that on Dahiel's face because he offered his hand. I'm Tobias, by the way. Dahiel nodded, taking the hand and shrugging. I'm sorry that I don't know much. We spent so much time keeping away from people that there wasn't much left for anything else. Tobias looked skeptical, but he didn't say anything. Dahiel coughed, changing the subject. So, what's on the schedule? Didn't you pay attention, Newsmith? Tallulah raised her arms to show off the chatting, card games, and small fights that were going on behind her. Squad assimilation. All right, but what does that mean? It means they don't want it to sound like we have any wasted time, another boy said, laughing. It's a fancy way of saying time to rest and enjoy ourselves. I'm Adam, by the way. Dahiel thought he would be able to remember this one. Adam was easily the smallest boy in the room, though judging by his face and voice, Dahiel guessed he was the same age as the others. "So this is our free time?" Dahiel asked the boy, but Tallulah answered. "Pretty much. But it's also the only time we have to study, and at least once a week we have organized squad building games. But don't worry, we played rugby with Squad 4 yesterday, so we won't have another game for a couple of days." Dahiel looked around, but he didn't see anyone that looked like they might be studying. Tallulah caught his look, leaned back in her chair, and grinned at him. "Our squad usually does whatever studying we plan on doing in the latter half of squad assimilation. We're a last-minute kind of squad." "We're so good we don't need to study," Adam snorted. "Unlike you." The boy who might have been Chris laughed. "I don't even know if studying would help. You're so far behind, I don't think you'll ever catch up." "You even got the years of the Foundation Wars wrong," Adam added. Tobias was grinning, but that didn't stop him from asking, "Were you really only out of school for 2 years? You even got some of the grade 6 questions wrong." Dahiel nodded, buying time to think of an excuse. Yes, but I missed a lot of school before then." Tallulah leaned forward, her chair legs knocking into the floor. "You missed school?" Dahiel scrabbled to cover his misstep. Yes. Well, our parents were sick for a while before they died, and I had to take care of my sister, and sometimes I just couldn't make it." He wasn't sure if the odd looks he was receiving were because his answer was so far afield from the realm of possibilities, or if it was just that he covered so awkwardly. He trailed off, afraid to take another misstep, and hoping that they would read his ill-ease as mourning. "You were poor, right?" one of the boys suggested. Dahiel nodded, not sure what the boy was getting at, but willing to take whatever excuse he offered. "I used to go to bed every night petrified that my dad wouldn't be able to buy out my draft the next year. I took after-school work and everything, but of course, eventually they couldn't pay. But you're lucky, at least you have your sister here with you. All my brothers were older, and they always got their draft paid out." Tallulah was leaning back again. "Yeah, but where are they now?" "How would I know? It's not like we get mail." "Not a serious question, Mark. I meant that at least we have food, clothes, and shelter." There was something of a warning in her tone. There was general nodding all around, but the boy, Mark, just mumbled, "At least they aren't going to die at war by the time they're 20. The nodding stopped. Adam shushed him, but Tallulah watched Dahiel. He had no idea if he passed whatever test they had obviously been giving him. The moment passed, and the girl took up the conversation anew as if nothing untoward had happened. "We don't have history again for a couple of days, so you have a while to memorize your notes. Lights out is in another 30 minutes, but if you can sleep through this racket... We've got 4 cots open right now. Take your pick." At the mention of sleep, Dahiel could think of nothing else. He could not actually remember the last time he had slept, and surrounded by the cheerful chatter, Dahiel could no longer keep up the fear that had kept him awake for the past hours. He took the nearest cot the girl had pointed out. He didn't bother changing into his sleep shirt he had been given, just kicked off his shoes and pulled the blanket up over his face. He drifted to sleep, half listening to the squad chatting, mostly about him.